The slap echoed through Terminal C like a gunshot. Dorothy Williams, 72 years old, stumbled backward from the force, her hand flying to her cheek as pain exploded across her face. She hit the armrest of a gate chair and dropped to one knee, her vision swimming with shock and confusion. Around her, 200 travelers froze mid-motion, their conversations dying instantly as they watched the elderly black woman struggle to understand what had just happened to her. "You will apologize to me right now," the white man standing over her demanded, his voice cutting through the stunned silence of Gate 27. Brad Mitchell was a large man, 6 feet tall, with the build of someone who used his size to intimidate, and he loomed over Dorothy like a predator savoring its dominance. His face was flushed red with rage, spittle flying from his mouth as he shouted, "You think you can just damage my property and walk away? You think I'm going to let that slide?" Dorothy's trembling hand pressed against her burning cheek, feeling the heat radiating from where he'd struck her. Her carry-on suitcase lay tipped over beside her, still rocking slightly from where it had bumped his bag, barely a touch, seconds before his hand had crashed across her face. She tried to speak, tried to form the apology he demanded, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean louder," Brad shouted, stepping closer, his shadow falling across her. "Stand up and apologize properly. Everyone here needs to hear you admit what you did." The gate area of Ridgeway Regional Airport had been bustling with the usual controlled chaos of morning departures just moments before. Business travelers typing on laptops, families corralling excited children, elderly couples moving slowly toward their boarding groups. Now every single person stood frozen, eyes locked on the scene unfolding before them. Some had their phones half raised, uncertain whether to record or intervene. Most simply stared, their faces registering shock, disgust, fear, and that particular brand of cowardice that comes from knowing you should do something but convincing yourself it's not your problem. Dorothy tried to push herself up from the floor, her knees protesting, her whole body shaking. She was a dignified woman, always had been. She'd raised 3 children alone after her husband died, worked 2 jobs for 15 years to put them through school, never asked anyone for handouts or sympathy. She kept herself neat and proper, even now in her retirement, even on this surprise trip to see family that some anonymous benefactor had arranged for her. Her navy blue coat was pressed and clean, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her small pearl earrings the only jewelry she wore. She didn't deserve this. She hadn't done anything wrong. "I said get up," Brad barked, and Dorothy flinched at the violence in his voice. Around them, a few people gasped, but no one moved. No one spoke. The fear in the terminal was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Dorothy managed to get her feet under her, using the chair for support as she stood on shaking legs. Her cheek throbbed with every heartbeat, and she could feel tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of all these strangers. Not in front of this angry man who seemed to feed on her fear. "I'm sorry," she said again, her voice stronger this time despite the tremor running through it. "I didn't see your bag. It was an accident. I apologize." Brad stared at her for a long moment, his jaw working, and for a second Dorothy thought maybe that would be enough. Maybe he would accept her apology and leave her alone. Maybe this nightmare would end, and she could board her plane and forget this ever happened. But then Brad's eyes narrowed and his lip curled into a sneer. "An accident," he repeated mockingly. "You people always have excuses, don't you? Always playing the victim." He turned to address the crowd, gesturing broadly. "Did everyone see that? She admits it. She damaged my property, and now she wants us all to feel sorry for her." Dorothy felt something crack inside her chest. The humiliation was worse than the pain in her face, worse than the fear coursing through her veins. She'd lived 72 years, survived poverty and racism and loss, raised good children, contributed to her community, tried to live a life of dignity and grace. And now this man was reducing her to nothing in front of hundreds of strangers, making her small and pathetic and worthless. "Please," she whispered, hating how broken she sounded. "I said I was sorry. What more do you want from me? I want you to understand that there are consequences, Brad said, his voice dropping to something more dangerous, more personal. He stepped closer again, invading her space, and Dorothy instinctively stepped back. I want you to remember this moment the next time you think you can. Step away from her. The voice came from behind Brad, low and controlled, and carrying the unmistakable weight of authority. It cut through his rant like a blade through silk, stopping him mid-sentence. Brad turned, annoyance flashing across his face before it shifted to something else. Uncertainty, maybe fear. The man standing behind him was tall, at least 6'3", with shoulders that seemed to fill the entire aisle. He wore a dark jacket over a military green shirt, worn jeans, and combat boots that had clearly seen real use. His skin was dark, his jaw set, his eyes locked on Brad with an intensity that made the larger man take an involuntary step backward. I said step away from her, the man repeated, his voice somehow quieter but infinitely more dangerous. Now, Brad tried to recover his bravado, puffing his chest out. Mind your own business, hero. This doesn't concern you. Maybe you should turn around, and that's my mother you just hit. The words were delivered with perfect calm, but there was something underneath them, something volcanic barely contained beneath a thin crust of control. So, I'm going to ask you one more time. Step away. The entire gate area seemed to stop breathing. Dorothy looked up through her tears at the man who'd spoken, and her heart stuttered in her chest. It couldn't be. He was supposed to be deployed for another month at least. He'd sent her a letter just 2 weeks ago saying he wouldn't be home until March. But there was no mistaking that voice, that face, those eyes that looked so much like her late husband's. Marcus? She whispered, the name barely audible. Her son didn't look at her. His attention remained locked on Brad, with the kind of focus that came from years of training, years of situations where a moment's distraction meant death. He moved forward with careful, measured steps, placing himself between Brad and Dorothy without ever breaking eye contact with the man who'd struck his mother. Brad opened his mouth, some combination of excuse and justification forming on his lips, but Marcus held up one hand. Don't, he said simply. Don't say a word. Just walk away. For a moment, it seemed like Brad might actually do it. His face had gone pale, and some of the bluster had leaked out of him. But then his eyes darted around the terminal, taking in all the watching faces, all the phones that were now definitely recording, and Dorothy could see his mind working. He made a show of dominance, established himself as someone not to be trifled with. And now this stranger was making him look weak in front of all these witnesses. Pride, Dorothy thought with a sinking feeling. Pride was going to make him do something stupid. I don't know who you think you are, Brad said, his voice rising again as he tried to reclaim his authority, but you can't just... He didn't get to finish the sentence because Marcus moved. One moment he was standing still, and the next his fist connected with Brad's jaw with a sound like a hammer hitting meat. Brad's head snapped to the side, and he staggered backward, shock replacing arrogance on his face. He barely had time to raise his hands before the second punch came. Then the third, each one precise and controlled and devastating. Dorothy watched her son work with a mixture of horror and fierce pride. This wasn't wild rage or blind violence. This was training, discipline, years of becoming a weapon in human form now unleashed in defense of the woman who'd raised him. Marcus's movements were economical, professional, each strike calculated to cause maximum impact with minimum wasted energy. Brad went down hard, his back hitting a row of chairs before he crumpled to the floor. Blood poured from his nose and mouth, and he tried to crawl backward, his earlier confidence shattered completely. "Please," he gasped, the word thick with blood and terror. "Please stop. I didn't know she was your mother. I didn't—" Marcus followed him down, not stopping, not slowing. Another punch landed, then another. The sound of fist hitting flesh echoed through the terminal, punctuated by Brad's increasingly desperate pleas. "That doesn't matter," Marcus said, his voice terrifyingly calm despite the violence of his actions. "You don't get to hit elderly women. You don't get to terrorize people because you're having a bad day. You don't get to make my mother apologize for existing in your space." Brad raised his hands in a weak attempt at protection, and Marcus finally stopped. He didn't step back, though. He stood over the whimpering man, his fists still clenched, his breathing steady and controlled despite the adrenaline that must be screaming through his system. "Do you understand me?" Marcus asked, his voice dropping even lower. "Do you understand what you did wrong?" Brad nodded frantically, blood and tears mixing on his face. "Yes, yes, I understand. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Don't apologize to me," Marcus said. He turned and extended a hand to his mother, who was still standing frozen by the chairs, one hand pressed to her cheek. "Apologize to her." Dorothy took her son's hand with trembling fingers, feeling the warmth and strength of him, the solid reality that he was here, that he'd come home, that he'd been there when she needed him most. She let him help her stand fully, and together they turned to look at Brad Mitchell, who was trying to push himself into a sitting position against the chairs, his face swelling rapidly, his expensive shirt soaked with blood. "I'm sorry," Brad choked out, the words barely intelligible. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. I don't know what came over me. Please, I'm sorry." Dorothy wanted to feel satisfaction. She wanted to feel vindicated. But mostly she just felt tired and shaken and grateful that her son had been there. She nodded slightly, acknowledging his words without really accepting them, because what did his apology matter now? What could it possibly change about what he'd done, about how he'd made her feel, about the fear and humiliation that would stay with her long after the bruise on her face faded? The sound of sirens penetrated the shocked silence that had fallen over Gate 27. Someone had called airport security, probably several someones, and now Dorothy could hear the rapid footsteps of multiple people approaching at a run. "Marcus," she said softly, her voice hoarse. "Baby, you need to—" "I know, Mama," Marcus said, and his voice had shifted again, becoming gentle, becoming the voice of her son instead of the voice of a trained warrior. "I know. It's okay. I'm not going anywhere." He raised his hands slowly, deliberately, making his movements obvious and non-threatening as 6 airport security officers burst into the gate area, with 2 uniformed police officers right behind them. They took in the scene quickly. The blood on the floor, Brad Mitchell curled up and sobbing, Marcus standing with his hands raised, Dorothy with a vivid red mark on her face. "Nobody move," the lead officer shouted, his hand on his weapon, but not drawing it. "Hands where I can see them. Everyone stay exactly where you are." Marcus didn't move, didn't speak. His hands stayed raised, his posture non-threatening, his face calm. Dorothy recognized that look. It was the same expression he'd worn as a little boy when he'd gotten into a fight defending his younger sister from bullies. Not regret, exactly, but acceptance. He'd known there would be consequences, and he'd chosen to act anyway. "Officer," Marcus said, his voice respectful and clear, "My name is Marcus Williams. That man on the floor assaulted my elderly mother without provocation. I intervened to protect her. I'm willing to cooperate fully, but I need you to understand that he struck her first." The officer moved closer, his eyes scanning Marcus with professional assessment. "You hurt him pretty bad, son. You want to tell me what happened?" Before Marcus could respond, a woman in business attire pushed forward from the crowd. "I saw the whole thing," she said quickly, her voice shaking with anger and adrenaline. "That man," she pointed at Brad, "slapped this woman for no reason. Her suitcase barely touched his bag, and he went crazy. He hit her so hard she fell down. This man," she gestured to Marcus, "defended his mother. We all saw it." "She's right," another voice called out, an older man in a veteran's cap. "That son of a bitch attacked her. Everybody here saw it. We should have stopped him, but we didn't. We were all too scared or too busy or too something. The young man did what we should have done." More voices joined in, overlapping, all telling the same story. Dorothy felt tears start to flow down her face as she realized that all these people who'd stood frozen and silent when she was being hurt were now speaking up, now demanding justice, now trying to make it right even though it was too late. The second officer, a woman with sharp eyes and graying hair, moved to Dorothy's side. "Ma'am, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Dorothy shook her head, then winced as the movement sent pain shooting through her face. "I'm okay," she said, then realized how ridiculous that must sound when her cheek was already turning purple. "I mean, I'm not seriously hurt. He slapped me, but nothing's broken." The female officer's expression hardened. Did he hit you unprovoked? Yes, Dorothy said simply. My suitcase bumped his bag. I apologized immediately, but he got so angry. I don't even know why. It was barely a touch. The lead officer turned to his partner. Get the security footage from cameras covering this gate. I want every angle. He looked at Brad, who was still on the floor, being attended to by airport paramedics who'd arrived with the security team. You're under arrest for assault and battery on an elderly person in a federal transportation facility. You have the right to remain silent. Brad tried to protest through his swollen lips, but the officer just continued reading him his Miranda rights while another officer moved in with handcuffs. Dorothy watched, feeling a strange disconnection from the whole scene, like she was watching it happen to someone else. The female officer gently guided Dorothy to a chair. Ma'am, I need to get your statement. Can you tell me exactly what happened from the beginning? Dorothy did, her voice growing steadier as she went through it. Marcus stood nearby, still with security officers around him, but no longer with his hands raised. She could see them talking to him, see the respectful way they were treating him once they'd established he was military, once they'd verified his story matched everyone else's. Your son is Marcus Williams? The female officer asked, glancing at her notes. Navy SEAL. Yes, Dorothy said, unable to keep the pride from her voice despite everything. He's been deployed for the past 8 months. I didn't even know he was coming home. The officer's expression softened slightly. Well, ma'am, he's probably going to need to answer some questions about the level of force he used, but given the circumstances and the number of witnesses corroborating your account, I don't think he's looking at any charges. That man assaulted you in front of 200 people. Your son defended you. That's pretty clear-cut. They watched as Brad was finally lifted to his feet, handcuffed, and supported by 2 officers. His face was a mess of blood and swelling, his earlier arrogance completely gone. He tried to say something to Dorothy as they led him past, but the officers kept him moving, their grips firm on his arms. I want to press charges, Dorothy said suddenly, surprising herself. The officer looked at her. I want him prosecuted for what he did. Not just to me, but so he can't do this to anyone else. So he knows there are consequences. The officer nodded approvingly. Good. We'll need you to come down to the station to make a formal statement, but we have more than enough evidence here. The video, the witnesses, your visible injury. He's looking at serious charges. Marcus appeared at Dorothy's side, finally released by the security officers. He knelt beside her chair, and up close, she could see the concern in his eyes, the way his hands shook slightly now that the adrenaline was wearing off. Mama, he said softly, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner. I'm sorry that happened to you. Dorothy reached out and cupped his face with her hand, the one that wasn't sore. Baby, you have nothing to apologize for. You came home. That's all that matters. You came home, and you were there when I needed you. I wanted it to be a surprise, Marcus said, and she could hear the emotion cracking through his controlled voice. I arranged the ticket through Aunt Jean. I was going to meet you at baggage claim, surprise you there. I never imagined I'd walk out of that jetway and see. I know, Dorothy whispered. I know, baby, but you're here now. You're home safe. They sat like that for a moment, mother and son, surrounded by the chaos of the terminal, the murmuring crowds, the official procedures unfolding around them. Dorothy noticed people watching them, some with approval, some with curiosity, a few with what looked like guilt on their faces. An airport employee in a manager's uniform approached, looking nervous. Mrs. Williams? I'm Robert Chun, the terminal manager. I want to apologize on behalf of Ridgeway Regional Airport for what happened to you today. This is absolutely unacceptable, and we take full responsibility for not having security intervene sooner. Dorothy looked at him, this young man in his press suit who looked genuinely distressed. It happened fast, she said quietly. I don't know if anyone could have stopped it. That's generous of you, Chin said. But we have protocols for exactly these situations, and they failed. I'd like to upgrade you and your son to first class on your flight, and I'm authorizing a full refund of both tickets. It's not enough, I know, but it's something we can do. That's very kind, Dorothy said. Thank you. Chun hesitated, then continued. I also want you to know that Mr. Mitchell is now permanently banned from this airport. We'll be sharing his information with TSA and other airports as well. What he did was criminal assault, and he'll face the legal consequences, but he'll also face travel restrictions. We don't tolerate violence against passengers, especially vulnerable passengers. Marcus stood, and Dorothy noticed he was a good 6 inches taller than the terminal manager. I appreciate that, Marcus said, his voice still carrying that controlled edge. But my mother isn't vulnerable. She shouldn't have to be defended. She should have been safe here in the first place. Chen nodded, looking uncomfortable. You're absolutely right. Again, we failed, and I apologize. They were interrupted by the female officer returning. Mrs. Williams, the paramedics would like to examine you before you leave, just to document your injuries for the case. Is that all right? Dorothy nodded and let herself be led to where the paramedics had set up. They were gentle as they examined her face, took photographs of the bruising, asked her about pain levels and dizziness. Through it all, Marcus stayed close, his hand on her shoulder, his presence solid and reassuring. You're going to have significant bruising for about a week, the paramedic told her, an older woman with kind eyes. Ice it when you can. Take over-the-counter pain medication if you need it. If you experience any vision changes, severe headaches, or increased swelling, go to an emergency room immediately. Do you understand? Yes, Dorothy said. Thank you. As they finished up, Dorothy noticed that the gate area was slowly returning to normal. The blood had been cleaned up, the chairs rearranged, new passengers arriving for other flights. Life moving on, the way it always did, absorbing trauma and tragedy and continuing forward. Mama, Marcus said quietly, do you still want to take this flight? We can reschedule. Wait until you're feeling better, until this is all settled down. Dorothy considered it. Part of her wanted nothing more than to go home, to hide in her small apartment where everything was familiar and safe. But another part of her, the part that had survived 7 decades of hardship and discrimination and loss, refused to let Brad Mitchell take anything more from her. We're taking this flight, she said firmly. I was coming to see family, and that's what I'm going to do. He doesn't get to ruin this for me. Marcus smiled, and it was like watching the sun break through clouds. That's my mama, he said, stubborn as ever. I learned from the best, Dorothy said, thinking of her own mother, who'd worked as a maid in white people's houses during segregation and never once let them make her feel small. Your grandmother would have done the same thing. They gathered their belongings, Dorothy's tipped suitcase righted and checked for damage, Marcus's duffel bag slung over his shoulder. The gate agent approached them nervously, informing them that they were welcome to board at their convenience. That first class was ready whenever they were. As they walked toward the jetway, Dorothy heard someone call out, "Thank you." She turned to see the businesswoman who'd spoken up first, tears on her face. "Thank you for being brave enough to press charges. I should have done more. We all should have done more. You spoke up when it mattered," Dorothy said gently. That took courage, too. They boarded the plane, and the flight attendants fussed over them, bringing extra pillows and blankets, offering drinks before they'd even taken off. Dorothy settled into the wide first-class seat, so different from the cramped coach seat she'd expected, and felt the tension slowly draining from her body. Marcus sat beside her, his large frame somehow managing to look comfortable in the luxury seat. He reached over and took her hand, and they sat like that in silence as the other passengers boarded, as the plane was prepared for departure. "I meant what I said before," Marcus said finally, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I'm sorry I wasn't there sooner. I'm sorry you had to go through even a second of that alone." Dorothy squeezed his hand. "Baby, you can't protect me from everything. The world is what it is. Bad things happen, and angry people exist, and we can't control any of that. But I could control being there," Marcus insisted. "I should have told you I was coming home early. I should have met you at your house, driven you to the airport myself. And then I would have missed seeing your face when you stepped out of that jetway," Dorothy said. "I would have missed seeing my son walk toward me, home safe from war. That moment before everything went wrong, when I first saw you and didn't quite believe it was real. That was worth everything that came after." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "He hurt you, Mama. He put his hands on you and made you afraid. I don't know if I can forgive that." You don't have to forgive it, Dorothy said. You just have to let the law handle it now. You did what you needed to do to protect me, and I'm grateful for that, but it's over now. He's arrested, he's going to face consequences, and we get to go see family. We get to move forward. I hit him a lot, Marcus said quietly. I probably hit him more than I needed to. When I saw you on the ground, when I heard you say he'd slapped you, something in me just snapped. All that training, all that control, it just evaporated. Dorothy understood what he was saying, what he wasn't saying. Marcus had been trained to be a weapon, to respond to threats with overwhelming force. But he was also her son, raised to be gentle and kind and protective of those weaker than himself. Those two parts of him had collided in that moment, and she could see that he was struggling with what he'd done. Listen to me, she said firmly, turning in her seat to look directly at him. What you did was defend your mother from a violent man. Yes, you hurt him badly, but you also stopped when you chose to stop. You didn't kill him, even though you could have. You didn't lose control, even though you were angry. You did exactly what needed to be done, nothing more and nothing less. The officers said I might still face questions about excessive force, Marcus said, and we'll deal with that if it happens. Dorothy replied, but Marcus, there were 200 witnesses who saw what he did to me first. There's video evidence. You're a decorated Navy SEAL, defending his elderly mother from an unprovoked assault. I don't think any prosecutor is going to be too eager to charge you. Marcus nodded slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. You're probably right. The officers seemed pretty understanding once they got the full story. Of course I'm right, Dorothy said. I'm your mother. I'm always right. That got a genuine laugh out of him, and Dorothy felt her heart swell with love for this man who'd been her little boy such a short time ago, who'd gone off to war and come back changed, but still fundamentally the same person she'd raised. The plane pushed back from the gate, and Dorothy watched through the window as the terminal grew smaller. Somewhere in there, Brad Mitchell was being processed, photographed, fingerprinted. Somewhere in there, security footage was being copied and saved as evidence. Somewhere in there, the gate area where she'd been assaulted was returning to normal. The passengers who'd witnessed it moving on with their travels. But Dorothy knew she'd never forget it. She'd never forget the feeling of his hand across her face, the humiliation of being on the floor while he stood over her, the fear that no one would help her. But she'd also never forget the feeling of seeing her son appear like some kind of guardian angel, the fierce protective love in his eyes, the way he'd placed himself between her and harm without hesitation. Tell me about the deployment, she said as the plane taxied toward the runway. Your letters were so vague. Where were you? Marcus started talking, sharing stories he'd been unable to tell her before, and Dorothy listened with the attention that only a mother can give, hearing the things he said and the things he didn't say, understanding the weight he carried and the things he'd seen. This was her son, her baby, who'd chosen one of the hardest paths a person could walk, and she was so damn proud of him she could barely stand it. The plane lifted off, and Dorothy felt herself rising above the trauma of the morning, above the fear and pain, above everything that had tried to diminish her. She was Dorothy Williams, 72 years old, survivor of poverty and racism and loss, mother of 3 beautiful children, grandmother of 5 precious babies. She'd raised her kids to be strong and kind and brave, and today she'd seen the proof of that in her son's actions. I love you, baby, she said as they climbed into the clouds. Thank you for coming home. Thank you for being there. Thank you for being you. Marcus leaned over and kissed her forehead, careful to avoid the bruised cheek. I love you too, Mama. Always. Below them, the city grew smaller, and ahead of them was family and celebration and a life that continued despite everything. Dorothy closed her eyes and let herself rest, feeling safe for the first time since that slap had shattered her morning. Her son was home, justice would be served, and she was going to be just fine. If you believe no black woman, especially an elder, should ever be assaulted and left alone in silence, hit that like button and subscribe to Story Arkansas for more stories that expose injustice and celebrate those who stand up for what's right. Drop in the comments where you're watching from and share this story with someone who needs to hear it today.